Good afternoon. I am Vasily Shadrin, postdoctorate fellow, Alfred and Isabel Bader postdoctoral fellow in Jewish history at the Department of History and coordinator of the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network at Queen's University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce you today's program presented by the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network, REES, at Queen's. The REES was formed in 2018 out of desire to bring greater awareness of Russia and Eastern Europe to Queen's University. We are an interdisciplinary group of scholars, history, philosophy, politics, Jewish studies, and we have brought a wide variety of events to Queen's in our short 2.5 years, including a film series in 2018, several information sessions on current events in Russia and Eastern Europe in 2018-19, and talks by professors and public figures from Queen's and beyond in 2020. If you would like to learn about further events and to be a part of the REES community, please Google us and subscribe and follow. We have Twitter, Facebook, and soon we'll have a website. So Russian and East European Studies Network at Queen's presents the first online event of its The End of History, Memory Politics in Eastern Europe 30 years after the Cold War series. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama published The End of History and the Last Man, about the promising arrival of liberalism and democracy behind the Iron Curtain, a future without antagonisms and in peace was supposed to come. However, in the past decades, history returned to Eastern European countries as nationalistic argument of exclusion in times of global migration and as invented tradition of conservative policies. The REES Roundtable Speaker Series provide a discussion forum for analyzing these developments by focusing especially on memory politics, as well as the action and reaction of the Eastern European countries' civil societies. Questioning Fukuyama's thesis about the end of history, we invite scholars for a series of conversations about history's applicability in the present. Today's conversation brought together scholars of the post-Soviet Eastern Europe from Belarus, Norway, and Canada. We will tackle the following topic: post-Soviet nationalisms in search of lost time. How does history matter in today's Belarus? My colleague, Dr. Kate Karitsky, assistant professor at the Department of Gender, Sexuality, Women's Studies at Western University and one of the founding members of the REES, will introduce panelists and moderate this discussion. Let's welcome Dr. Karitsky, please.
Well, thank you, Vasily, for gathering us, and welcome to, and thank you for coming to all our listeners or viewers out there. 2020 is a year of elections, aborted, troubled, contested, and perhaps just as importantly, or maybe not perhaps, it's a year of protests, of eruptions of popular will and discontent, implicated with notions of democracy, nationness, and memory. So in this event, we want to explore the relationship between popular self-understanding, historical narratives, and politics. And we want to do it in the ever-exciting region of post-communist Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Our immediate concern and motivation is Belarus, kind of for obvious reasons, but we're going to cast a broad comparative net to help us think about what's happening in Belarus and in the region by looking at cases as diverse as Ukraine, Moldova, and Central Asian republics. We welcome all questions. Please use the Q&A function in your Zoom. I will gather them and post them to our speakers after we are done. If you have a question for a particular person, please indicate it in your question. I now would like to, without further ado, gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers in the order in which they will present. So Marharyta Fabrykant is coming to us from Minsk. She is a senior research fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics and an associate professor at the Belarusian State University. She holds PhD degrees in sociology and social psychology, and she conducts comparative research on national identities and national history narratives with a focus on a bottom-up demand for and perceptions of national identity frames. She has authored numerous publications, including articles published in Europe, Asia Studies, Nationalities Papers, and Slavic Review. Helge Blakkisrud is a senior researcher at the research group on Russia, Asia, and international trade at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Helge's research interest includes center region or center periphery relations in Russian Federation and nation building and nationalism in Eurasia. He also worked extensively on Eurasia's unrecognized de facto states. He has published several books and edited and co-edited volumes, including most recently Russia Before and After Crimea, Nationalism and Identity 2010 to 2017. It came out in 2018. And Russia's Turn to the East came out in 2018. He has also published with journals such as Demokratizacja, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Europe, Asia Studies, Nationalities Papers, Nations and Nationalism, and Eastern European Politics. And last but not least, Magdalena Dembinska is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and an academic director at the Center for International Studies at the University of Montreal. Her research focuses on ethnic politics and conflict, state and nation building, nationalism and diversity in Eurasia and Central Europe. Her book, Vivre ensemble dans la diversité culturelle, Développement en Europe centrale et orientale, was published in 2012. She has published, among others, in International Studies Review, Nations and Nationalism, Federal and Regional Studies, Ethnopolitics, Nationalities Papers, National Identities, European and Regional Studies, Canadian Journal of Political Science, Études Internationales, Journal of Political Deliberation, Comparative Political Studies. Her current research focuses on the de facto states of Abkhazia and Transnistria, on the policies of parent states towards their external minorities, for example, Poland and Poles in Lithuania, Ukraine and Belarus, as well as on Europe-Russia relations at the border, as in Moldova, Estonia, Kaliningrad. And now I turn the mic to Marharyta.
Thank you. I've got 20 minutes, right? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to present at such a really exciting event, because I believe it's of real importance to discuss the hot topics of today, not in the mood of these guys and girls are good and these are exactly the other way around, but well, in a more meaningful way, and not because we sometimes want to get detached from all the emotion, but because it really makes sense to stop reiterating the things we've already read so many times and try to understand something less obvious, something deep. Well, in regard to Belarus, at least quite a lot of people agree that there are many things that are unclear and not so obvious. In particular, well, right now, Belarus is in the news, and it has been so for the last couple of months. Before that, for a quarter of a century, their international focus of attention has it was elsewhere for the most time of the period, and people outside and people here in Belarus are wondering what exactly is it that is going on. There is a near universal consensus that, well, something is changing right now in front of our eyes and well, all around us, those residents of the country. And quite a lot of well, policy papers, well, journalism, well, attempts at analysis focus on the dichotomy. In the once it used to be like that, but now it's all different. In my presentation, I'm going to focus not on things as they used to be, well, in the early post-Soviet times, nor on the things as they are unfolding right now, but rather I'll try to uncover this well, the content of this black box, like how did we come from what used to be back then to what we are going through right now? Because, well, well, the counterintuitive changes largely depend on kind of intuition that's applied to them. Obviously, well, there were some reasons. Okay, there are some obvious changes, and they're going to lead to some more changes. But obviously, there was some prior, not so visible, not so obvious change. And based on my research experience on well, various kinds of data, interviews with the individuals, and well, some genres of public discourse, I can see that to a considerable extent, these changes are changes in the attitudes towards history and memory. In the title of this event here, Soviet nationalisms in search of lost time. Obviously, we can read at least two meanings. First, yes, many, well, not all, but many, and stereotypically Eastern European nationalisms love painting an image of a golden century as something in the past when, well, the sun shone brighter and everything was much better, and well, what they position as the essence of the nation, its potential reached its pinnacle. Like that's when we showed who we really are. He really stands for the best we can, well, remember or invent or construct. You choose, yeah, and that means that that's what we can revive. If and then how we should proceed towards the glorious future, we are emulating the glorious past. This is the first meaning, very much entrenched in the theory of nationalism. The second meaning is particularly important for, well, those nationalisms that weren't super successful. You know, in well, especially over the last several years, well, there was that renaissance of nationalism in, well, a number of regions, some closer to Canada, some closer to Belarus, and some equally far from both. But in general, yeah, we in the social sciences were worried, and we tried to explain why on earth, yeah, would people in our super enlightened age be so attracted to nationalism? So why is nationalism so successful? But we can approach this question from the other side. Why in some places, in some cases, nationalisms are not at all successful? Why sometimes, despite all this emotional appeal, well, nationalist entrepreneurs fail to attract enough followers to succeed in what they want to do. And this question is particularly meaningful for Belarus. And obviously for those nationalisms that didn't succeed in the past, maybe now, as we're living through these tumultuous times, maybe now they're trying to compensate. Yeah, they are looking back, they're analyzing what they did wrong, and yeah, they're trying to make up for the lost time, lost them, by using some wrong tactics, or maybe opting for wrong strategies even. And the question is whether which of the two, or maybe both, or maybe none, apply to well, today's Belarus. The Belarusian case is particularly interesting because, well, in the well, what I like to call the early post-Soviet time, or in their well, in their early 1990s, after well, the Velvet revolutions that were well, essentially national democratic, and quite a few people today are nostalgic about this well, combination of nationalism and democracy. Now it seems well, rather out of time, but back then, yes. Then Belarus appeared to be well, one of the very few, if well, arguably almost the only country where nationalism as an ideology and as a political movement and as a general well, in a kind of worldview, apparently failed to appeal to the people beyond their small minority of well, activists and sympathizers. And yes, this is the question why it didn't work then. There exists, well, in small but vibrant, especially now, field of Belarusian studies, there exists a number of explanations, and well, I believe all of them are meaningful and contribute in an important, valuable way to the general picture. But the thing that is sometimes overlooked is the lack of appeal to this memory thing. We in the memory studies, especially well, professional historians, often speak about their pernicious use of history, distorting well, historical truth for well, political purposes, about their usable past. Yeah, so here again, the focus is on the usable past. But what makes the Belarusian case interesting to memory studies is that here we, well, for quite a long time, we had something exactly the opposite. The past that failed to become used. It was maybe potentially usable, but, and here I'd like to quote an interviewee, a participant of well, some of my earlier research, now graduates, believe second year students from well, Belarusian University for majoring in something very well, far from history and social sciences and humanities, who gave me a very interesting, thought-provoking interview on his own national identity and the way he understands well, the whole national identity issue. And among other things, what I found particularly important, had told me something like that, of course. Okay, so I have a bunch of friends, those guys in historical reconstruction movements who like to put on this fake medieval armor and run around with those fake medieval swords, and they love it so much, and they wanted to they wanted me to join the crowd, but I personally, I don't understand. I mean, okay, what's the point? Okay, so, well, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Commonwealth, okay, the Commonwealth, supposing vetoed being in their mausoleum instead of Lenin, what difference would it make to me? End quote. Yeah, so, well, everybody knows, so Lenin is very, well, some people remember him the day before yesterday. As for Vytautas, it's well, Belarusian version of the name Vytautas, the Grand Duke, the Prince, and nearly was crowned as a king of the Grand Duchy, very well, powerful person, quite good at self-advertising, among other things, and obviously a character of the contested history with Lithuania. So, yeah, who lived in the late 14th, early 15th century, as far back in time as that. So the question is interesting. Yeah? The point, okay, we glorify one character, some other character in history, and early 20th century, early 15th century, a revolutionary person, well, a medieval prince. What's the difference? So obviously, insofar as this search for lost time and lost heroes from the glorious past is not attractive, obviously there isn't any difference. Now the early post-Soviet Belarusian nationalism was like a very prototypical case of this romantic, well, East European, well, so-called small states and nationalism, all with their going back to history, claiming what we consider our own, establishing the links between the past and the present, enjoying our cultural heritage, so on and so forth. And this sleeping beauty metaphor, yeah, the nation like a sleeping beauty that's always been there but needs to be awakened over the kiss being well, a lot of research in history and related branches of knowledge, and well, somehow it failed to appeal well to the majority. There is a small and dedicated minority, but well, according to this theory developed by Miroslav Hroch, it had to expand. Well, by then it did not. And the question is whether the interest in memory is developing right now with these changes, or whether it's not. And if not, what is the role of history? First of all, in the contemporary events, the debate is not on the historical past, and especially it's not on the search of the glorious past. It's not of these of one of these perennial East European issues like contested history, defending the most prestigious parts of history from our friends and neighbors, and whitewashing some, well, dubious medieval characters who failed to act according to their, well, contemporary moral code and song. Rather, the focus is, insofar as history is brought in, the focus is on the of getting rid of the undesirable parallels in with the past. So yeah, we are making history now. We are not. We use some symbols because we want to use them now. We project our kinds of meaning on these symbols, and basically that's it. And if there was some negative association with them in the past, well, okay, we can dispute it, but also we can refuse to dispute it, which is another kind of tactics. So what is inside this black box? My answer, well, based on a series of narrative writing on quite a large sample, is that in the Belarus national identity, over the last decade, I indicated a curious thing. First of all, there was this big demand for positive and this evaluative kind of national identity, which is a very universal thing. Yeah, I want to belong, and I want to be happy about the group I belong to. And there were some general ideas about what a national identity is, yeah, and how to define to which group I should belong, which criteria apply, and which of them are of larger importance. But what was lacking on one and on the other hand, I found a huge demand for that was role models. Role models of Belarusians with whom the contemporaries, the contemporary lay people could identify themselves. There was a very little need for escapism, like into our glorious past. There was hardly any demand for fake medieval armor for the this romantic stuff, but there was a huge demand for specific characters, role models with whom I can identify, not the general rules how to define my national identity and what I should feel about it. Should feel is quite ironic in my opinion, but how to enact my Belarusian national identity, how to be a Belarusian. The role models that could apply to me, not something I would be on special occasions and in some play acting, but some everyday clothes. And what I think reviewing now is some attempts, how successful time will show, some attempts to satisfy specifically these demands. We have some role models, and instead of these general notions of what people should think and feel, we have very specific instructions how people should act, and we have just compliments. You're so great, you're so nice, you're quite incredible, lavished on the people. That's what people want, many of them. And that's where their supply and demands meet. Obviously, it's only one of the many possible ways of satisfying these demands. And does it mean that the past doesn't matter, the history doesn't matter? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, what's occupied this empty space left by this apparent irrelevance of memory, usable memory about the past, is the situation that history is now. We are history. We are making history. We are people whom future generations are going to emulate. Our clothes are this equivalent of fake medieval armor for their future generations. And I've seen numerous quotes in the media and on social media written by private individuals along these lines. Yeah, like we're making history in the future. Students are going to learn by heart what we are doing now and memorize the names and dates and and this is an alternative way of making, well, time meaningful now through the history by creating the past as we want it to be without the invention of tradition for us by, well, doing something about historical truth, whatever it is. But for doing this work in advance for future generations, so that they wouldn't have to distort, objective reality, complicated, sophisticated, deeply ambivalent, so on and so forth, so that they have this ready-made glorious ideal for the future generations. And that's what makes people feel so great, regardless of any, well, kinds of pragmatic purpose. I find it's an interesting twist, and yeah, as I said, that's what makes the Belarusian case just so interesting. Well, thank you for your attention.
So now we'll go to Helge. Thank you, Marharyta.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and its puppet regimes across Eastern Europe, Francis Fukuyama, as Vasily pointed out, boldly declared that the end of history as such. But now, 3 decades later, I think it's safe to say that history is back with a vengeance. The inevitable victory of liberal democracy that Fukuyama predicted seems increasingly illusory as more and more regimes across the world question globalization and universal values and call for a turn or return to the national, to the allegedly unique values, traditions, and history of their respective nations. In my paper, I explore this global turn through the prism of post-Soviet nation building. And I've chosen to focus on school history textbooks and how history has changed since independence as a proxy for studying nation building in Eurasia. Obviously, a regime has at its disposal a wide repertoire of various tools that it can apply in order to stimulate national identity and legitimation of the regime. You have state symbols, you have various institutions, you have national holidays, etc. But many would argue that this educational system stands out here among these tools for nation building because of its ideally universal reach that will, through the educational system, you will reach a whole cohort of the young generation. So through a state-approved curriculum that you would have in most of the Eurasian states, that the state will decide what books you would read, and often it will be only one book per grade, so that all pupils learn exactly the same version of history. In this way, state authorities have a unique way of controlling what values and self-understanding the new generation are taught. A whole cohort of young people learn the nation, learn the national identity. So I have looked at school history textbooks, and I should stress that what I present here today is based on post-Soviet Central Asian textbooks. Together with Marharyta, I have a project proposal in that I hope that will get funded, where we will look at school history textbooks in 3 different cases, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and in Georgia, and look at how 3 post-Soviet states characterized by ideological, regional, and ethnic cleavages, respectively, use history textbooks to try to overcome or solidify these cleavages. But that is a project for the future. So here today, I'm going to talk about a project I've done together with colleagues in Central Asia on Central Asian textbooks. Together with local partners, I've gone through post-independence textbooks in all 5 Central Asian states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. And we have compared these books against a Soviet baseline, that is, history as it was taught in the late Soviet period, in order to examine continuity and change in how these new regimes construct the national past. We're looking for what historical facts that remain constant in the historical narrative, what has changed, and what these shifting interpretations of historical events, what they can tell us about the evolving self-understanding of these regimes and the national self. So, what these 5 states maybe share with Belarus was that at the onset, or at the time of the October Revolution, they had a weakly developed national identity. In Central Asia, it was more a question of lifestyle, whether you belonged to the nomadic or the sedentary part of society. And many people would be multilingual, and the ethnic labels would be something alien at the time. Categories that we take for granted today were in many cases non-existent. For instance, ethnonyms. There were no Kazakhs. The Kazakhs were Kyrgyz, and just to make it more complicated, the Kyrgyz were Kara Kyrgyz or Black Kyrgyz. There were ethnic groups that today look at themselves as ancient, like the Tajiks, that were not really a category that was recognized at the time. They would be more talking about Persian speakers. And you would have categories that were identified at the time, for instance, the Sart, that just disappeared because of the Soviet policy on national identity and the national territorial delimitation of Central Asia. So through Korenizatsiya and the delimitation in the 1920s, you put in place the map and the nations that we see in Central Asia today. To a large extent, they're all shaped, if not constructed, by the Soviet experience. As for history, from the 1950s onwards, it started a little bit different times in different Union republics, but from the 1950s onwards, you started to get local history introduced in the school curriculum. So you had world history and you had Soviet history, but now you'd also have a third component, the local Union Republic history. That was meant to strengthen national identity, but obviously also to link the local experience up to the Soviet master narrative. So typically these local history textbooks, the authors would strive to identify local heroes, local subplots that would sort of build up under the Soviet history master narrative. You would look for revolutionaries or radicals that would have acted locally and link them up to the master plot, to the drama that took place in St. Petersburg during the revolution, for instance. So in many respects, this was just like the national policy at the time. It was national in form, but socialist in content, and it fitted seamlessly into the bigger Soviet master narrative. And then, of course, also Soviet history was not a static history. It would change over time, but what you see in Central Asia would be, as you move through the 60s and 70s, more emphasis on the voluntary union, how these peoples entered into the Russian Empire through negotiations and agreements rather than through conquest. And you would see an emphasis on the friendship of the peoples. And then if you move fast forward to 1991, breakup of the Soviet Union, obviously there was a need to rewrite history because you had to disentangle this subplots from the Soviet master narrative and turn them into full-fledged national histories befitting for an independent state. And in Central Asia, maybe more so than in many other former Soviet Union republics, this was complicated because they were Soviet constructs. They were so intrinsically linked with the Soviet experience, the Soviet modernization project, the Soviet delimitation of the region, etc., etc. And also, of course, these were not the republics that had been the frontrunners in the quest for breaking free from the Soviet Union. Central Asia had more stumbled into independence. So there were no large-scale national mobilization that you would have, like the one you would have seen in the Baltic republics, in Armenia, in Georgia, etc. So there was little to build up on in that respect. But once independent, the new regime had to legitimize the new order. It had to invest in nation building. And then, obviously, the easiest thing to turn to was to turn towards the nation. And I try to highlight some common features that you see across the region when it comes to post-Soviet nation building through history textbooks, and how history has been mobilized to back up under the new regimes, under new independent statehood and a new national identity. The first such common feature, I would say, is that history was nationalized, and in two different ways. First of all, as I already hinted, well, you had a very ideologized history writing in the Soviet Union, with historical materialism and Marxism, Leninism, and a sort of a ideological iron jacket that decided how you should write history. But with communism gone, the vacuum was filled by the nation. The other way that history was nationalized was that it, in almost all cases, you saw a shift of the history being taught in schools from this being the history of the territory, of the state, to this being the history of the nation, where all other ethnic groups, minorities, were marginalized. Obviously, these Union republics in the Soviet times had been formed around a titular nation, and it had already been, to a large extent, the history of the titular nation of this Union Republic. But now, but at least then it had paid lip service to the friendship of the peoples and presented it as more multinational. Now history became the history of the ethnic nation. And just to take one example that shows this, in Tajikistan during the Soviet period, all history textbooks used in school would be called the history of the Tajik SSR. After independence, the history textbooks are called the history of the Tajiks. So shifting from a territorial base to an ethnic base. A second common feature is the nation becoming more ancient. An attempt to project the roots of the nation as far back in history as possible. Graham Smith talked about post-Soviet nation building and history as history having to be linear. It had to be continuous. You had to fill in the blanks, and it had to be singular. It had to be just one master narrative. And I think in all cases in Central Asia, you have stuck to this formula: linear, continuous, and singular. You project history, the roots of the nation, as far back as you can, and you present a linear story, one of a national struggle, some setbacks, some glorious moments, but they all fit into a narrative of a continuous struggle toward the ultimate goal that was realized in 1991, the realization of national independence for the ethnic group, the titular nation. A third common feature and related to this is what I would call a race for autochthonous status. And that is related to, this is especially related to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but it has also relevance for some of the other post-Soviet states in Central Asia, and is related to ethnic groups having lived intermingled in the region. And now, in order to legitimize statehood and give status to the nation, you race to become autochthonous, to be the original population of the region. A good example here is the Uzbeks. Uzbek nomads, they are latecomers to Central Asia. They conquered Mawaranagar in the early 16th century, and that's obviously way too late in order to claim autochthonous status. So already in the Soviet period, they started to redefine the origins of the Uzbek population, and this has been further developed since independence, so that the Uzbek nomads that conquered Central Asia, they conquered an already existing nation that only lacked the name, is a claim now. So that when the Uzbeks come, the only thing they're credited for is giving a name to an unnamed, already existing nation. And in that way, the Uzbeks can co-opt Tamerlane and the Timurids. They can tap on to a much older history and thus compete with the Tajiks, who also claim to be autochthonous. And this will put Uzbeks in an advantage when it comes to who owns Samarkand and Bukhara, which the Tajiks also would claim. And if the Uzbeks had settled for just being Uzbeks related to the Uzbek nomads and not co-opted previous empires and rulers and states into their national ethnic history, they would have been at a disadvantage. So the only exception here, when it comes to this claim for being old, ancient, autochthonous, is Kazakhstan up to a certain point. Kazakhstan, because of its complicated ethnic composition, for a long time opted for a forward-looking nation-building project. Instead of looking for a glorious past, the Kazakhs looked for a glorious future. So this was, they were building something new, and the best was yet to come. And you could see this, for instance, yeah, I think it's illustrated by the futuristic architecture of Astana, the new capital, now renamed Nur Sultan. This was a different take on it. But also Kazakhstan has caught on to this return to the national and the past in recent years, especially since 2014, and with increasing uncertainty about Russian designs for Central Asia. The Kazakhs have become more outspoken and more focused on the historical past, not only a beautiful future, but also a glorious past. A fourth common feature, and the last that I will bring up here, is that there is a gradual decolonization taking place, a distancing from the common shared Soviet experience. And this you can see develop gradually and at different speeds in different countries. We have looked at different cohorts of textbooks, and the first cohorts of textbooks were often written by the old Soviet authors. They now just changed a few things and republished the history as the history of independent Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. But then gradually things are changing. You see new authors coming and launching new arguments, adding to a distancing of the nation from the shared Soviet past. Old veneer of a friendship of the peoples is wearing thin. And even in states that you could say would be positively inclined towards the Soviet experience, like in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where you had this focus on the multi-ethnic composition of the state and living together, you see a change. The voluntary union, the description of the volunteering joining with the Russian Empire is disappearing, and you talk more and more about colonization and oppression. And you see also in more recent editions of the textbooks that there is increasingly a look for alternative trajectories, that modernization could have happened via other paths. For instance, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you in recent years, in the newest editions of the history textbooks, have seen how the very nascent national intelligentsia at the time of the October Revolution that had other ideas for a national future for the ethnic group have been recast. They were villains in the Soviet history writing. Now they have become alternative heroes of what could have been an alternative future for these states. And we see an increasing nationalism, not only in the textbooks, of course, but in wider society. Again, if you look at Kazakhstan, first post-Soviet president Akayev talking about Kyrgyzstan as our common house, and now with the recent revolution and the new acting president Japarov coming to power on a very nationalist-oriented program. So to sum up, all Central Asian states engaged actively in rewriting history since independence. And in the process, history has become more exclusive, focused on the ethnic, on the titular nation. The titular nation has gotten deeper, more ancient roots, and often it's also been embellished with new glorious pasts through co-optation of other states or other histories. There has been a competition, especially between the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, about who came first, what constitutes the autochthonous population. And finally, history has gradually been de-Sovieticized. It's no longer a history about friendship of the peoples, but about Russian and then also Soviet colonization of Central Asia. I think I have to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Helge. We'll now move to Magdalena. You have to unmute yourself.
That's done. Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation and I'm very glad to participate in this hopefully constructive discussion. I have a PowerPoint because, well, I was offered the opportunity to do that. So I will share with you my screen. And here we are. So I will build on the theoretical aspects of what Helge exposed in Central Asia. Then I will try to zoom out a bit to look into history narratives as they are used for geopolitical orientations. And then I will try to go back to Marharyta's presentation on Belarus. So I think it's really interesting what we have here as presentations because, well, the first presentation on Belarus somehow questioned the use of history for nation building and state building. And then we have the Central Asian states who use the past to rewrite history to legitimize the new state building after the Soviet Union fell out. And what I'm trying to do here is to show how the history is used for political purposes in the case of Moldova, where there's actually like a battleground over the historical truth. So I'm looking in the in-between region, so between Russia and the EU, I will be focusing on Moldova, arguably a similar story, well, similar but not obviously not the same, could be told of Ukraine, but arguably not of Belarus. So I will start with the present day elections that are well, that we should follow in Moldova. As you may know, there's the presidential election. The second tour will be held on Sunday, and it is in between Igor Dodon, the socialist, and Maia Sandu, who is one, well, Dodon is arguably pro-Russian and Sandu pro-European in a very schematic understanding of the politics of Moldova. But still, even though the electoral campaign in Moldova is not really framed in historical terms, etc., because of COVID, because of the very difficult socioeconomic situation in Moldova, what we see is actually we have a déjà vu, because the same candidates were actually candidates for presidents in 2016. The same, so we had Dodon and Sandu also candidates for presidents. And in 2016, history was much there during the electoral campaign, as it is usually in Moldova. All identity issues, the history issues are on the agenda. And here I just post something that during the campaign, Igor Dodon said, "I will insist that Moldova should," I'm sorry, I don't see because I have your images on my, yes. So I will insist that Moldova's history should get back in school. Our children must know the historical truth. There are many things in Romanians' history that don't fit the reality. Then in just a few months after the elections, Dodon won the presidency, and he proposed to change the flag, the Moldovan flag, to eliminate any similarities with the flag and coat of arms of Romania, and proposing a new design for the flag, which would symbolize the historic principality of Moldavia, dating back to 14th century. So you have this, in electoral terms, the history is on the agenda, and here I just put, because in 2016 also Vladimir Putin congratulated Dodon for his win, and offered as a gift, a map, an ancient map of the Principality of Moldavia, where you see, I don't know if you see, but I will show you other maps. You see that the present-day Moldova and the western part of the Principality of Moldavia, which is now in Romania, which are named Moldavia. So it was quite significant, and obviously Romanians did not like it very much. So the obviously this all these propositions to change history textbooks, etc., was tagged as being like a gross manipulation of history aimed at political agenda to strengthen ties with Moscow rather than with Romania. The flag did not change because it was not approved in the parliament, because, well, where Dodon was president, the government was pro-European, so they did not make consent, there was not consensus. So this history symbols are all on the agenda, electoral agendas, and in politics, all over the place, and since the beginning of the 1990s. So what is it all about? So since the beginning since the end of the Soviet Union, Moldova is looking for its soul and for its place in the world. And this is a big issue. And two different ideologies that do use history are in place, and one is Romanianism and the other Moldovanism. So who are Moldovans? Moldovans are actually Romanians. So it's the same thing. So Romanianism would emphasize the shared ethnic, cultural, linguistic background between Moldovans and Romanians. Romanianism contends that Moldova is culturally part of a larger Romanian nation, and even some believe that it should be reunified with Romania. I will go back to that later. So this is one ideology, one narrative, historical narrative that is in place, and that is in complete opposition with Moldovanism, which stresses that Moldovans are ethnically completely different from Romanians, and actually Moldova should remain separate nation state, independent from Romania. And there is, I will also go back to that, there is Moldovanism that's actually built on the Soviet identity doctrine of Moldovans being different from Romanians. And it is a bit Russophile, but it depends on different strands, but still it is associated with Moldovanism, associated with a Russophile tendency. So all of these Romanianism and Moldovanism are embedded in history. They use historical past to present the Moldovan nation as being either Romanians or a separate nation from Romania. So I will not go through, there are historians do a better job than I can do, but still what you see here in the Middle Ages, you had the Principality of Moldavia. So this is what President Putin gave to the map to Dodon when Dodon won the presidential elections in 2016. So this is it. Present-day Moldova is between Prut and Dniestr. So this is the historical Bessarabia region, which is now Moldova, with the part here of Transnistria. I will go back to that later. And but that was in the Middle Ages. Then in the beginning of 19th century, the Russian Empire annexed Bessarabia, so the eastern part of the Principality of Moldavia, and it was in the Russian Empire, while the western part of the Principality of Moldavia formed part of what is now Romania, with Wallachia, and with Transylvania. So you have Moldavia, present-day Moldova, that was it was Principality of Moldavia, then it was in Russian Empire. Between World War I and World War II, it was in Greater Romania. And then after the Second World War, the Bessarabian region was re-annexed, annexed, unified, depending on which narrative, historical narrative you will use, to the Soviet Union, and the Moldovan USSR was formed. So there was back and forth. The region, which is present-day Moldova, was back and forth in Romania and then Russian Empire, USSR. So the history is extremely politicized. So every change in government you see different visions of the history teaching. So I will not go into the role of education, teaching, etc. Something that Helge did before me. So you understand that it is very important how history is taught. So between 1991 and 2009, there's some 40 different history textbooks that are published that were in complete different narratives. Curriculum, history textbooks, curriculum in schools were changed 3 times. During the first period of reforms, to 1996, 2001, Moldova introduced two history courses. One was called History of Romanians, and Universal History. In 2001, the newly elected Radomir Voronin wanted to introduce, to replace History of Romanians with History of Moldova. Then massive demonstrations were in the streets of Chisinau, among others. The Council of Europe also intervened and was pushing instead to have like an integrated history, which finally was adopted in 2006. But then in 2009, new government comes in and changes the integrated history into history. Then this becomes History of the Romanians and World History in 2012. So we have this back and forth of different narratives and history teaching between the version of Moldovanism and version of Romanianism. And I did put in bold the fact that in 2009, the changes that were introduced were actually introduced by under the Minister of Education, which was Maia Sandu, the present day presidential candidate, yes, and the presidential candidate in 2016. So what does the Romanianism in terms of geopolitics? Romanianism presents a different vision from Moldovanism. So for Romanianists, Romania is the elder brother. Romania is the one through which, well, the country, we will go through the European Union, and Romania will help us with that. So we have to have good relations, and it's our elder brother, we should have good relations with Romania. Contrary to Russia, which is depicted in this narrative as being an occupier and as being a threat to us, the greater Romanian nation. Moldovanism, on the other hand, presents a different narrative where Romania is the one that we should fear, is the main external other, and with this historical memory of occupation of Romania that occupied Moldova in between the two world wars and in 1940, 1944. So it is associated with fascism and so on and so forth. So Romania is not Moldova. The Romanian language is not the Moldovan language. Moldova has its own language, and it is completely different from Romania. And we have one friend. The Russia is the one friend that is the one who will protect us and always has protected us during whole history from different enemies, etc. So the picture here you see, it's the Eurasianist Economic Union. Dodon actually managed to get the status of observer within the Eurasian Economic Union in 2017. Even though Moldova has an association agreement with the European Union. So it's a very interesting ambiguity, which is somehow supported by different history narratives. What is interesting is that divisions or these discussions and conflicts on history narratives, history textbooks, etc., somehow is reflected or reflects itself. We never know which is the egg and chicken, yes, but in society. Society is deeply divided. So you have always half, more or less half of the population that is pro-EU or pro-Russia. When in 2019 there were opinion polls, over 50% of Moldovans read Russian newspapers, and Russian media has high trust in Moldova, and same thing, high trust for more or less 50% of Moldovans also read European Western newspapers and which have high trust. So you have this battleground in society, geopolitics, and history is linked together. So what you have is conflicting historiographies. where you have Romanianism and Moldovanism that are fighting together. Romanianism, which presents its history as being the one of Romanians, Moldovanism, the one against the Romania. But then you have a third thing here, Transnistria. So if I have time, do I have time? Just to quickly, so what's this? The battleground is even more complicated than just these two Romanianists, Moldovanists, because you have the secessionist region of Transnistria, which is de jure part of Moldova, but which so the separatist, there was a separatist war in the beginning of 1990s, 92, 93, and which ended by separatists' victory, ceasefire, and actually Moldova does not, Chisinau does not control the territory of Transnistria since then. And the Pridnestrian people, the Pridnestrian authorities, they too use history and history narrative to justify and legitimize their separation from Moldova, and the nation building is still in process, and it is much there to construct the Pridnestrian Transnistrian people. So just to it is important to understand that the Transnistrian region was never part of the Principality of Moldavia in the medieval times, and it was not part of the greater Romania in between the two worlds. It is the territory that is east to the Prut. To Dniestr River, where Stalin in 1924 created an autonomous SSR of Moldavia, which was part of the Ukrainian SSR, and it was in this part, and this is when the Soviet doctrine of Moldovanism was created too. So this Moldovanism as being, so Moldovans are different from Romanians, and they speak Moldovan with a Cyrillic alphabet and not with Latin alphabet. So what you have now is that legitimation of the separatist cause. First it was like Soviet-like Moldovanism, but very quickly the ideologues in Transnistria pointed that, well, now it's incorrect and pointless to propagate Moldovanism. Actually, we should construct the Transnistrian people that are based on Soviet-like multiculturalism and composed of true our Moldovans, Russians, and Ukrainians, because this region of Transnistria is mostly Russophone, and composed of three different ethnic people, but the construct of Transnistrian people is there to legitimize the separatist cause, but you have to construct and to build these people, and for that history textbooks and schools are much used. And Transnistria is presented like as a drop in a Ruski mir. And this is the third ideology that is within this Moldovan de jure state. You have Romanianism, Moldovanism, and Transnistrianism that are in constant conflict. So in conclusion, our discussion points, this is where I'm going back to Belarus a bit. So historical narratives are used to build nations, people that will legitimize states' power. It is a resource for internal political struggles. It defines enemies and friends, and so it is used for geopolitical purposes. So it is a part of politics in Moldova, it is part in politics in Ukraine. We can go back to that in the discussion, because there's a tension on memory issues around the representations of Europe and Russia, yes? So, yes, historical narratives are flexible. You can rewrite history, as Helge told us, but at the same time, for these constructions, rewriting to take hold, it cannot be purely invented. It has to take root somewhere in collective memory and in history. So, the historical experiences constrain the invention of traditions, that's for sure. And I was wondering, and that's the question maybe for discussion, so does history matter on present day politics in Belarus? Marharyta said, not really. And that's really interesting because it's indeed it would be a very unique case. But so I was thinking, so white flags and colors, are they invested with historical narratives? Why protesters go to Kurapate? Why? So what's the, because one thing is, I understand that we make history now in Belarus. That's for sure. It is a historical moment. We make history, but then in the education school system, there will be some history writing. So what is the ancient roots of Belarus that is usable? Is there anything usable? Because even Transnistria, which is like from scratch, that's people from scratch, that they do use history to make sense, make this continuity that Helge talked about, continuity and meaning, the past that presents the future, etc. So I was wondering, and maybe that's for our discussion, I don't know, I'm just asking because it's really intriguing for Belarus if the history is starting now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for these exciting presentations. I have a lot of questions for everybody, but before I start with my questions, I'm going to take some from the audience. So I am not sure, I'm going to read some of the questions because I'm not sure if our panelists actually see them. But the first question is for Helge. And it asks, do you think that the turn to nationalism in Central Asian states such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan alienated part of population, particularly Russians, who suddenly became a minority in a new country which was trying to find a new identity? Unmute yourself, Helge.
Maybe I should start with unmuting myself. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. And the short answer is yes, I guess. I did my master's back in the 1990s on Estonia and Latvia and the Russian-speaking minorities there, and how they overnight went from being representatives of the center to becoming a minority in the new independent states. And what I did then was to use Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty, and look at what kind of responses the Russian-speaking population would take: exit, migration, voice, creating political parties and organizations, or loyalty. When it comes to Central Asia and also some other parts of the post-Soviet space where I've carried out research on nation building, for instance, I've been working on Abkhazia and the ethnic minorities in Abkhazia and how they respond to the ethnification of politics in Abkhazia. I think that both there and in Central Asia, you see quite a bit of acceptance of the titular nation monopolizing politics and the state. It's true that many people, for instance, maybe in particular in Kazakhstan, have voted with their feet and left. But I think that a majority of those who are left are still influenced by the Soviet traditions of this being the state of the Kazakhs, or Kyrgyzstan being the state of the Kyrgyz, created to cater for the national identity and interest of the titular nation. So I think there's been a lot of, for the Russians, as well as other minorities, they have mostly stayed out of politics. They have left that to the titular nation, and then to a large extent maybe sought other opportunities in the private sphere, in economics, but politics, the domain of the titular nation. And it is problematic, obviously, because over time, again, this Soviet tradition might wear thin, and big minority groups might start to raise political issues and demands, and there is no tradition for including them in politics. You have this very Soviet, I would say, organizations where you have representations of various minority groups. For instance, in Kazakhstan, you have this council where all ethnic groups are represented, but they have zero political influence. Where decisions are made, it's mostly only Kazakhs, and that will be a problem in the future, I think.
Thank you. So I am going to put the question to a panel, but I want to start with a statement that memory narratives or political play with historical, with the past has a tendency of closing, of either closing the boundary of belonging or closing or going further, preventing progressive politics. So first, going to Marharyta, the idea that Belarusia does not engage in politics of memory is kind of seems to suggest an optimistic future insofar that if there is no past, maybe the future has a chance. But all this to say that our learning from Central Eastern states and from Moldavia may suggest that political entrepreneurs will find historical narratives very useful in future political battles. And they will invent, will take from the many facts and strands of history that the future, that the past provides. So now I want to kind of continue with the question, but take it to Helge and ask, you are looking at the history books, which means that you're looking at a narrative that is at some level settled, that at some level hegemonic. So but there may have been contestation before. So I want to ask you, is before we got into this veneration of the ethne, before we forgot the friendship and now see the victimization, was there contestation? And a following question, what does the victimhood, what does making the Soviet Union into a colonial power rather than a brother, what does it do to them? Like why have that, why does this change happen? You know, Kazakhstan for a long time continues with the story of kind of openness to the story of USSR. And then you say that past 2014, continuing to the present, there is this investment in the narrative of victimhood rather than friendship. So why? So this must be, I think I'm pushing the envelope here insofar that memory narrative goes beyond legitimation of the state. It has political payoffs for the actors on the ground. So what would those be?
Marharyta, would you start?
Okay. First of all, well, I wouldn't say that there is well zero appeal to the past in well in today's Belarus, but well it's rather less than in well elsewhere in the region and Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and especially well in these times of well the renaissance of nationalism, and definitely very much less so than in this early post-Soviet Belarus nationalism of the 1990s. But it doesn't mean that it's always going to be the same. I think what Helge said in his presentation about Kazakhstan, that might in well somewhat well foreseeable future also apply to Belarus. I mean, this thing that they started to develop the future as unfolding now. I remember a friend of mine who lived in Kazakhstan for some time and gave me a bar of chocolate with the slogan "Astana, the city of the future." And okay, yes, but this the design of this bar of chocolate was like a kind of well, kind of national or well ornaments like carpets and so bright gold against bright blue backgrounds. So there is some well ethnic appeal here, I think. And I'd say that the ethnic kind of nationalism can really come to the forefront on well, one of the two occasions, or one of the two extremes. On one hand, when well, it's very early on, and we are building a nation, our vision of a nation and the nation, very much at the same time. And the other, in Belarus now, apparently much of this well diachronic comparison with Belarus of the past, various past, and Belarus for today was replaced with synchronic comparison with other countries, like negative scenario. Do you want to be like the base in Ukraine? Sorry, it has nothing to do with the objective reality in Ukraine. It's well part of this rhetoric. No, we are not going to have it so like that. We're going to have it the nice way, better than in Poland or in the Baltics, because well, some rather varied and rather far-fetched, in my opinion, explanations for that follow. So here, yeah, the idea of what a nation is there is no need to develop it. There are so many well collective role models among the neighbors, and they come in as more salient than well their Belarusian early medieval principalities or was not. And the opposite extreme is when the vision of the future is established, and it needs to be not defined, it's already defined, but legitimized. And then there is when we may need this turn to the past once again. But now we are caught in between the two.
Yes, as for hegemonic histories versus what level of contestation has been there, I think these histories are not settled yet. I mean, there's always an element of contestation, but I think here there is, in many cases, quite a bit of contestation about what the national history should look like. And we see that there is development from one textbook to another throughout the 90s and up to the present, that there are new versions coming, but they mostly move in one direction, and they establish more and more distance between the national history and the positive influences of the Soviet experience. School history textbooks, that kind of history is a special genre, and the main battlefield is probably general academic history, but we see this reflected also in the way that this history that is meant for student consumption is changing. And then you asked, what's in it for the regime? Why do they do this? And I'm not sure if there is a simple answer, because also this has happened at various speeds. For instance, in Uzbekistan, they were very quick in branding the Soviet period as an extension of Russian colonization of Uzbekistan. And I guess in the case of Islam Karimov, then it was maybe to distance him as an old Soviet communist leader from that project. It seems a bit odd maybe, but that in order for him now to win, to reinvent himself and be a national leader, they very quickly turned their back on the Soviet Union, while other former Soviet first secretaries seemed much more comfortable in bridging the Soviet period with independence. So I don't have a good answer, I think. Sorry.
Thank you for this. I will go to the next question from our audience, and the question it's from Zsuzsa Szerg, and it goes to all the panelists. So she says, thank you so much for these terrific presentations. A question to the panel. What do you think it takes, for instance, how much coherence in the state center, how much state strength, how much vulnerability to homogenization in the population, how many generations exposed to this type of state project for ethnic nation building, for which national history making is critical, translate into mainstream popular sentiment? The variation across these post-Soviet states offers an excellent opportunity to explore. And thank you for your insights, says Zsuzsa. So who wants to tackle this one?
I can try.
Go ahead.
I can try. Well, it's a very difficult question. What does it take? One thing I would say, probably just to follow up on what was said already, I'm not sure that it's just ethnic nationalism that uses history. I'm sure that you see, we are in Canada, and Canada has a history, even though it is not an ethnic one, but there's textbooks, and these textbooks are different in Quebec and in the other parts of Canada. So there's, so I would, that's one thing. What does it take? It's a more of a guess from my own studies that it takes generations. Certainly, it's not for a historical narrative to take root in popular sentiments. This is what I understand from Zsuzsa's question. It probably takes generations of socializing, among other things, in the educational system. But for that to be, probably some kind of state stability is necessary too, so that you don't have these changes of narratives all the time. So from the list that Zsuzsa proposes us, I would say yes, stability, state stability, and so that this hegemonic probably discourse is the mainstream discourse is translated into popular sentiment. It takes stability and socializing in schools and probably 2 generations.
You're too optimistic, Magdalena.
Probably.
Well, again, this, of course, it's a wide variety of strategies being applied throughout Eurasia. But one example or one case that I've been working on, Tajikistan, you said, yeah, we need state stability, and we need an agreement on who is the nation. And in the case of Tajikistan, you had first, of course, you had the civil war, so that delayed the whole thing. But since the civil war, we have had one national idea after the other. So it was the Aryan nation, it was a focus on the Samanids, it was Zoroastrianism. You have had one project after the other being launched to see if it will fly and get that popular reception that you were talking about earlier on during your presentation. But in the 30 years that have passed since the breakup of the Soviet Union, there's still no fixed or agreement on what it means to be Tajik. And there is, I would say, no interest in trying to include the rest of the population into something bigger, or to accept them into the understanding, the emerging understanding and developing understanding of being Tajik. So I can't really see that they have made much headway during the first 30 years, and maybe then 2 generations is too short in that case, at least, for translating this into mainstream popular sentiment. I think that they at least are very far from that at the moment.
If I may jump in, because the Pridnestrovia and the Transnistrian case is an interesting case, because you see some kind of adherence of Transnistrian people to the Transnistrian project as Transnistrian people, regional identity. So it took 1 or 2 generations of authoritarian, very stable rule. But I think that it is, I would never be so optimistic as to say that something is fixed. No. Identity and history narratives are never fixed. So it is in continuous transformations, but that's my ontological stand.
Marharyta, do you want to give us your take?
Well, I think I addressed this issue to some extent here in my previous reply about the 2 extremes. What I'd also like to add is that, well, one other reason that about the ethnic also kind of nationalism is not that important in this new, well, what I call a new position discourse right now, is that for well, the supporters of well, this ism is well, it's particularly important not to lag behind the times, to be modern, to be well up to date and on a par with the most well advanced countries. So in Belarus, if ethnic nationalism becomes well in their role model countries, then I think it has a fair chance in Belarus. Otherwise, if ethnic nationalism is scoffed at as going back, then maybe not. And one other thing in my research on the Baltic identities, I came across a curious thing where the elements of well, traditionally ethnic kind of national identity, like speaking the national language, get a new meaning, not this cultural heritage, but kind of, well, what economists call a coastal signal. Yeah, because outside of, well, Baltic country, learning a Baltic language is not such a great time investment. So if you're going to learn this language well enough to speak it, just means that you're going to stay and get this well-known demographic situation, yeah, with this huge external migration to the West. It matters. So I found that it was related not to the other, well, components of ethnicity, like well, ancestors and so on and so forth, but to civic identity, like respecting laws and institutions as a sign of loyalty. So I think we are much more likely to have specific parts of ethnic nationalism to be incorporated into new frames and with new meanings than the resurrection of ethnic nationalism as a whole.
Okay, I have a next question from the audience. This is from Olga Talal to Marharyta. She asks, how has Lukashenko responded to the emerging demand for contemporary role models, if at all? In general, has he tried to appeal to a particular usable past in response to the protests?
Well, as for the first part of the question, definitely yes. In particular, for the past, well, as far as I remember, at least for the past 7 years, there's been a number of visuals, billboards. There are a lot of them are in Minsk. I believe in, well, in other cities, towns in Belarus too, with the slogans for Belarus or I love Belarus, and depictions of like typical representatives of various social groups based on age, gender, vocation, really an illustration. It could be an illustration to sociological work on social stratification, like contemporary Belarusian society, things like that. Very recognizable, very kind of people you might want to identify yourself with. Very happy-looking, prosperous, content, sometimes against nice nature, the background, sometimes all in more urban settings, so on. And here you can find somebody sociodemographically close to you, whoever you are in, well, contemporary Belarus, and identify yourself with them. But they are not larger than life heroic figures. Yeah, they are ordinary people as they are. They show as like a mirroring of people as they are, as opposed to this idea of, you are heroes when you follow these instructions. Very simple, very straightforward. So the question is, which of the two options is more appealing? The answer is, well, it depends. Obviously, either option can be appealing, but it's also a way of showing the role models, like who you are, and that you can be happy as you are, what you are. As for the second question about the response to the protest, well, it's I'd say it's much too early to say, because, well, historical narratives are not well, normally constructed overnight. And I say that the response right now, well, at least a meaningful response, would lie in the present and in the vision of the future, because that's where, well, their contestation basically is.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to now ask Magdalena to, if you wanted to revisit the question that you had for Marharyta about the flags and the importance of geopolitics in the protests as they are. I wanted to give you a break after you finish talking, but this is a great question. So if you want to maybe give Marharyta a run through it again. Unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay, so one of my questions at the end of the slides, yes, was about the how, if, and how the white, red, white flags and colors, how they are invested with meaning. If it's not with historical meaning, if it's not with reference to the historical narratives of early 1990s, even by the opposition then. So how it is invested, what is the meaning of this flag? Why did they take these colors, and how they explain it?
Well, it's another interesting question, because, well, in the very beginning of its all, well, what is habitually called the new opposition, it is tried to invent their own symbols. But eventually they went back to the old symbols, which by and by gave their opponents some grounds to show that's okay, there's nothing really new about it. They are basically the same people. They have no new ideas. They just want to continue from where they lost in the 1990s. And I'd say what is particularly appealing for this new position and its supporters in the white, red and white flag is this ambivalence. On the one hand, well, they did not invent this symbol. It dates back from, well, from some ancient time, like 20 years ago. For people who are 15, it's ancient time, and they feel rather old, okay. And on the other hand, we can reinvent the meaning of this symbol. We can create the usable path exactly the way we want. This symbol symbolizes us. It's this Durkheimian version of society worshipping itself, yeah, as a kind of deity. And they really differ in this way, at least from the version of the early 1990s. I remember back then I went to secondary school. There were a lot of stories, starting with kids' books, about some legends going back to at least the 12th century. And there is very little of that now. It's the very thing that it's enough to have something from some past. And we don't want to go into details. Come on, we may uncover some things, well, not to our liking there, and so yeah, we can create it all anew.
I have a question from Rebecca Manley. Thank you very much for these fascinating papers. My question relates to the memory of World War II. In Central Asia, World War II was central to the narratives of friendship of the nations. In the Baltics and the Ukraine, memories of the war have been particularly divisive. I wonder if the panelists might comment on the memories of the war and how they function in contemporary Belarus, Central Asia, and Moldova. Who wants to go first?
I can start.
Okay.
I would focus on Kyrgyzstan, because I usually teach at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek in May every year, and there, even if I've said before that in general there is a distancing towards the Soviet experience, it's the memory about the war is still very much cherished. You have the Immortal Regiment and you have people wearing St. George ribbons in May in Bishkek. So I think for many Central Asians, that is a memory that is also somehow nationalized, focusing on their national contribution to the Great Patriotic War, the sacrifices they made in order to defeat Nazi Germany. But it's still very much celebrated. It's not a very divisive thing in Bishkek to wear a St. George ribbon or take part in commemoration. That's seen as something normal and mainstream.
Magdalena?
Okay, I'll go. So in Moldova, as you can guess, it depends on whom you're speaking to. So in Transnistria, that's for sure that the Second World War is presented as being the fascists, and particularly fascist Romania and Moldova, who came to Transnistria and occupy that, and that was Holocaust, and there was a Holocaust, yes, in Transnistria. So it's presented as Transnistria as the victim of Romanian fascists. And what is interesting in Transnistria is that there is like there is in the historical narrative, there's a link that is put in between the experience of this Romanian fascism during the 1940-1944 and the civil war in 1992. Because the narrative says that the war with Moldova in 1992 is another proof of the Moldovan fascism that is helped by the fascists in Romania. So this is the discourse. Then if we move to Moldovanism, for Moldovanism, yes, the victims of the Romanian fascists, yes, because even though Moldova was part of the Greater Romania, the narrative says that this province of Greater Romania, which was the Bessarabia, was always forgotten, not developed during the Greater Romanian period, etc. So Moldovans were victims of Romanians too. Then when you go to Romanianists, well, that's probably not very surprising that it's like a collective amnesia. You don't really talk about that. It's not a glorious past. So there's not much on that period in Romanianism, I would say.
Marharyta, do you want to offer your thoughts about World War II memory?
Well, and very briefly, yes. Yeah, well, in Belarus, obviously, the World War II, rather the Great Patriotic War, plays a huge role in the history narrative. It's very prominently represented in well, history teaching schools at universities, and I'd say, besides fairly recent memory, and I'd say that it's used, well, if there is something that looks like usable past, it's, these references to the World War II, but these references are first of all as a kind of borrowing well, a language, like partisans who are the real partisans, you are, we are, no, you're not, this kind of debate. And the reason for this debate is that, yeah, this language is shared because this narrative is very present, not like the medieval principalities. And the second kind of justifying an evaluative part, moral appeal in a very general way, like those bland discussions on Facebook, who's the first to call their opponents some nasty thing from the Second World War. But it's not the case of trying to learn from the past. It's the case of trying to not even to enter the past with those meaning is from the present, and yes, the case of a usable language from the past.
So thank you so much, Vasily. Yes, please go ahead. Of course.
I have a question because Marharyta is here, and because you know there's a huge debate. There was a huge debate in Moldova, or the country name, is it Moldavia or Moldova, and this reflects obviously Romanianism versus Moldovanism, and you have this, is it Belarus or Belarusia? Mm-hmm. And if so, why the discussion, and is it not based in history?
Mm-hmm. Well, Belarus was the name of the Belarusian Socialist Soviet Republic. Nowadays it's Belarus, and within Belarus it's not at all contested. But some Russians, especially those who were socialized in using the words Belarusia, first time you see every time I see on Facebook or some other popular social network some news in Russian that's referred to Belarus, I can count until 3, maybe 2, before some irate Belarusian comes and posts a comment, "You're nasty imperialist, it's not Belarus, it's Belarus." So, well, here you are. I didn't post it, okay.
On that note, Vasily, we are out of time. So I would like to thank our fantastic presenters and thank you, our fabulous audience, and Vasily for bringing us all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much all. Thank you, Kate. And yeah, I wish we should continue. We didn't touch on religion. Right. Okay.
Or gender. Or gender.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great to see you all, and yeah, have the great rest of the week. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.